ultimately the question is, which should the Western world take an active role in supporting Ukraine? And you can kind of go on about this. Like you don't have to specifically stay within this. You can go off if you'd like, but keep it with Ukraine and Russia.
So I am debating in the affirmative that the West and the United States should support Ukraine. Um, I think one of my main points will be is that you had the Budapest Memorandum in 1993, where there was these post-Soviet states, the Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan inherited nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. So the United Kingdom and the United States got together with Russia and encouraged and influenced these three countries, Ukraine in particular, to give up their nuclear weapons to Russia. And they complied with this. And part of the agreement was that we would protect their sovereignty and their current borders, as it was at the time of the agreement in 1993. So basically, their territorial integrity. We had that as an official agreement in writing. They do say that there was talks about no NATO expansion eastward, but that's a private talk with Gorbachev, and Ukraine never joined NATO anyways, so it's kind of irrelevant to Russia invading Ukraine. But we agreed to that, and we should be, a man of our word. We already emboldened the Russians by our horrible pullout of Afghanistan. That's one of the reasons why they thought they could get away with it. Um, and I guess my second point would be that the Cold War never really ended. People like to pretend that we could have brought Russia and China into the West, or into the, trade unions and into the global economic order. But I think that was wrong. I think everybody kind of realizes that now with China, but for some reason we're still having this debate over Russia. Russia, the current government in charge is just the KGB, the same KGB that tried to influence and infiltrate every single government around the world, and that spread revolutions around the world, and the same countries that invaded countries around the world throughout the Cold War. Um, so I think it was just always naive to think these countries changed. Uh, Both China and Russia aren't basically openly communist now. They have a lot of corporation control in their country rather than just direct state control in both countries. But Russia in particular is basically just the KGB. The KGB took power, and obviously everybody knows Putin is former KGB. The KGB was the main bloc in Russia that was able to take control out of the 90s chaos that happened. And I yield whatever time I have left.
Okay, that's fine. Tsar, you can make an opening statement. Keep it under 2 minutes or so.
Yeah. I'm arguing the position that Western countries, while yes, we have writing and we have agreements that say we have an obligation to help and we have a moral obligation to help, unfortunately, we do not have the resources necessary to extend our help that we had promised. The promise that we made was made at a different time during a different period of economic prosperity, and at one point we could offer that help, but we are no longer in a position as to where we can extend our forwards so graciously to other countries like we once could, and that's about it.
Okay then.
It's not that complex
Yeah, well, that's the opening
of a
statements
statement.
done. And now, since you were talking, Watchman is going to reply to that, and you guys can just go, take turns.
Yeah, just back and forth, back and
Yeah.
forth.
Okay, so why don't you think we have the resources to fund Ukraine?
Well, obviously we have the resources because we're giving them to you. But what I should say is we don't have enough resources to keep constantly giving to them.
Well, I would agree that we don't have resources to give to them forever, right? Like forever's a long time, but like, what do you mean we don't have resources? Like in a week, we don't have resources in a month? Like how long?
I'd give it about maybe a year and a half before things start going very bad.
Going
That's
very,
just a
very
personal
bad in terms of.
in terms of in terms of shortages and whatnot.
Okay, so is that more of a problem that we should, and I'd like to see what you have, like you base the data off of, but is that in terms of, like, that's not really an argument that we shouldn't fund Ukraine. That's an argument that we should invest in our military industry, that we
We
should
should invest
open
in
more
our own
factories in the
country.
U.S.
My position is that we should be investing in our own country and not other countries such as Ukraine.
But that is an
And
investment into our country, into our industry, opening factories,
that,
employing thousands of Americans.
yes, but is a war industry an industry that we should want to pursue?
Well, it was very profitable for us in World War II with the Lend-Lease program.
It's profitable, sure, but is that the thing that we want to be internationally known for?
Well, just not that alone, no. But if we're doing it for the right causes,
And what's the right causes in this situation?
standing up for Western values,
Western value. So
yes.
what? So like Western values are more important than international reputation, than than things adjacent to that as well.
I think our international reputation will be emboldened. I think more Europeans actually like us more because we're supporting Ukraine.
Okay.
Like maybe Russia doesn't like us as much, but I think a lot of countries do appreciate it right now.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if I may pitch in, right? I mean, ultimately speaking, the Russian invasion of Ukraine does not look very good internationally. So if you want to go solely from what looks good on PR, then I mean, helping Ukraine is the
Yeah.
will help you accomplish that goal. But ultimately, that's not what the debate is about. We're not talking about what we should do for PR, right? Should the Western world
Yes.
continue to fund Ukraine not solely on consequential reasons, but is it like the morally just and correct thing to do? That's kind of the question. And why do you think that's not the case?
I think that I think it comes down to that we really have we have you sure you could make an argument that we have a moral obligation to help them because they're getting invaded, they're getting displaced and whatnot. And I think if we have the resources available, yes, we should take refugees and that sort of thing. But fully but fully funding them, defending their country, I don't think we have an obligation to be doing that.
So, what about the Budapest Memorandum? Isn't that a
Like I
obligation
like I
that's
said,
written into?
that's a different time. At one point, we could hold up that we could follow through on that, but that not today
Why not?
because we are not as economically prosperous as we were at that time.
How? And is our military not better today?
Well, our military, you can make a case, yes, that our military is better, but that doesn't mean that we should be sending our military there.
It would almost be easier to support them today because now Romania and Poland are NATO countries that that border Ukraine. So it's easier to supply them weapons. Before in 1994, they weren't NATO countries, so it would have been harder actually,
Hmm. Okay,
like just logistically.
so what obligations do you think the United States has to be supporting Eastern European countries in their invasion? Why should the American people be paying to support a country thousands of miles away across the ocean? Why should we care?
You mean besides the agreement we signed?
Well, yes, besides that, because
Uh-huh.
that really isn't the most pressing thing.
Well,
Why should the American people be putting their tax money, the money that they toiled for, right? Their own money. Why should they be paying for another country's war?
it's the same reason why we should defend a place like Taiwan. If Russia keeps teetering, Russia's basically they have a track record in the whole Cold War
Oh,
and
so it's a
since the
domino argument.
90s.
It's like a Vietnam argument is what you're saying. Because
Yeah, you
because
could
if
say that.
you're saying if Ukraine falls, then Moldova falls, and then Romania falls, and yada yada.
Yeah, and we
But
actually have obligations to Romania and Hungary and Slovakia and
yeah, but we don't have
Poland.
obligations to Ukraine though. Ukraine isn't in NATO.
Well, we do have an obligation to them with the Budapest Memorandum. And
Well,
if, why would we want Russia to be more powerful? I mean, Ukraine is one of the most resource-rich countries in the entire world, and most of this is recently discovered. So they didn't actually know that during the Cold War. If Russia were to take Ukraine, they have way more resources. They have way more of a resource stranglehold on Europe. And then, it's just they're just building up for the next conflict. And to
okay.
think that, by suddenly cutting the plug on funding Ukraine, you're going to break up some sort of Chinese-Russian alliance that's been there since the communists took over China is just ludicrous. You're never going to break that up. They're neighbors.
Yeah.
So if you think the Chinese are a threat, you should think the Russians are a threat. They go together. It's not like a new thing. It's not like something Obama did or something Biden did.
Uh, well, eh, I think on top of the resource issue and the issue of constantly maintaining a supply of weaponry, munitions, and etc. I think that the United States and other Western countries involving themselves in Ukraine, I think that will only lead to escalation. And I think that the more that this war escalates, the more that a world war or something a bit smaller but still akin is bound to break out.
Don't you think it's more likely to happen if Russia were to take Ukraine?
And I don't believe so. At least it would be delayed a few years.
Well, you see, it seems to me that every time the United States has shown weakness in the world, Russia or China has taken a measure. So we can look at Ukraine in 2014. Right before that, you had Obama's red line in Syria, where he said no chemical weapons will be used. Assad used chemical weapons, and then he didn't go into Syria like he said he would, and he broadcast that statement to the international world. Right after that, you had the events that happened in Ukraine in 2014, and then Russia decided to take Crimea and the Donbass because they knew that the United States was weak and Obama wasn't going to do anything about it. And then that same thing happened when Biden pulled out of Afghanistan. And our whole government that we put in there for 20 years got overrun by the Taliban. What happened right after that? Russia invades Ukraine again. Every time we show weakness on the international stage, it emboldens our enemies. So if we show weakness here, what's next? Maybe China will take Taiwan. Maybe Russia will take the Baltics next.
Okay, but the thing still, the question still remains that how long should the United States continue to support Ukraine? Should we keep supporting them until either Russia pulls out? Should we keep supporting them until like what's how long do you think we can keep this up? How long do you think we can keep up the constant flow and supply of men, munitions, and weaponry? How long do you think that this should go on for? How long should we put up with this?
I feel like Americans are just so like just a short-term memory loss all the time, right?
It's
Like it's not
at the
like
end
this
of the
war has been
day.
going on a long time though. This war has been going on for a year and a half, and yeah, lots of people have died, and lots of equipment has been lost. But compare that to World War One or World War Two or any of the other wars that we've been
Yeah,
involved
but we
in.
don't want a repeat of that. Why would you want a repeat of World War II?
But you're saying that we can't do this now, or is it that we don't want to? Those are two different arguments, right?
Well, we can do this for a time. Long term, it's not going to end very well. But the thing is that we can. But number one, the American populace really does not care very much. And that's supported by most people. If you ask most people if they care very much about Russia Ukraine, most people are going to say no, because we have no obligation to care. And the
You
United
have
States
polling
government,
data for that?
whatever agreement they signed, what obligation do we have to continue um, our support of of the agreement that we made?
You have
Why
polling data
should
that is not
it's
popular amongst
why
Americans?
should North America? Why should a country in because it's Europe's turn to act on this. It's Europe's turn to act, really, because this is a European affair. This is a strictly European affair right now. Because unlike situations like Taiwan, where it does concern multiple continents, this is a strictly European affair. This is Europe's turn to act. It's not America's turn to act. Because we've acted enough. We've acted as the world police for decades, and you can see where this has got us. It's gotten us in a lesser position than we started out with during our isolation period. Being the world police has put us in a worse position internationally than if we were in our period of isolation as we were decades ago. This is Europe's problem. This is Europe's turn to do something about a European affair and stop looking to the United States to bankroll their affairs.
So I think that your polling data is wrong. I think that Republicans are about 50-50 on the war, and then I think Democrats are like 90% in favor. So I think you're just dead wrong on that. And then I would agree with you that it is Europe's responsibility. If I was president, and one thing that I did like that Trump did is he encouraged Europeans to pay their 2% for NATO, right?
Of course.
If I was in charge, like, yeah, like, of course Biden's doing, he's mismanaging the war. He could be doing better. So you should be encouraging the Europeans to do more. In fact, you should be encouraging the Ukrainians. There is actually Ukrainian-made shells going to the front line. There's a rumor that there's not, but there is. It's been happening for at least 6 months now. But I would encourage them to do more. I would encourage the Ukrainians themselves to make more factories, and I would encourage the Europeans to do that also. I mean, but like for example, the Polish, they've given like 25% of their tanks or something to the Ukrainians. That's a lot. And then you look at the Baltic states, like they've given a huge share as well.
Okay,
But
but
yeah, the other
Watchman,
European countries could definitely.
this is true,
Avoiding
right? I have to point this out that, like, well, it's true that the Eastern European countries give quite a bit in foreign aid. America still gives like $75 billion. So the majority of the foreign aid is still being given on America's like fault, right? Whereas here in Europe, the European Union does not give like half of that. So what do you want to do about that? What do you think about that?
What do you think Europe should do, if I may interject? What do you
Yeah,
think
because
Europe
the
should
question
do?
isn't only America. The question is the Western world, right? That was the
Yes,
topic of the
the
debate.
entire Western world, and that's what I wanted, because I don't want this debate to be like, oh, should America do something? It's important to clarify that should the entire Western world, should Western Europe, should North America, should South America, yada yada, should they, uh, what should they do? Should they support Ukraine? And once we've covered that, the question that I want to present is, what should Europe be doing to handle its European affairs and stop looking to the West for its own for aid to its own affairs?
So I think
What
the
do you
big problem is that Biden is obviously very anti-oil, and all these environmental policies that have come in aren't very favorable to the oil industries. So we should reverse that, right? Because the Europeans right now are in a stranglehold over Russian oil, and that's the main reasons why people like the French and the Germans, for one, since 2014, never really followed the sanctions against Russia, and that's why they're hesitant to support them further. That's why they would rather see a peace sooner. But if we were to support them and give them oil, and not give it, but sell them oil and increase our outflow, that would be very good. And then we can encourage them, hey, look, we'll sell you the oil, but you need to give some of your used military equipment over to Ukraine. And I think they would go for that.
Hmm.
Of course, I'm no fan of Biden. There could be much more better management of the way things are being done.
Yeah, I agree. The thing is, and that raises another question. Is American involvement in Ukraine? Because as I said earlier about American positions weakening, let's look at the other side of that. Is American bankrolling of this endeavor, is it actually weakening the position of European countries and their own autonomy? Because if they are reliant on America, then what autonomy would they have? Do you think that the position of European countries are being undermined by American funding?
Do you mean their domestic policies?
What I mean is, if Ukraine, because we're in a simple term, we are practically nation building in Ukraine right now to fund their war right now. So what exactly would they have after the war? After the war, when America has built and is maintaining their industries, their cities, their development, do you think that puts Ukraine and furthermore other Eastern European countries or European countries in general in a lesser position? Is it weakening their
How
position
are
and their
we?
autonomy?
How are we nation building in Ukraine? I don't think that's a proper usage of the word.
Well, right now we are supplementing their industries. We are giving them supply.
But that's
We're
not
building.
nation building. Nation building is a term that we used in Iraq, for example, where we literally had to build all their institutions from the ground up. Where we had to we
Well,
basically,
that's
I mean,
why
for a
I
time we
said
had a
it.
military government in charge of Iraq, right? Like, this is
That's
nation
why I
building.
said a simplified term, because I couldn't think of a better term to use. But I suppose I should be more broad. We are building their industries. We are supplementing their industries. So does that put Ukraine and furthermore other European countries in a lesser position because they are so reliant on the United States to supplement their own industry?
Obviously, putting Ukraine in a better position, because if we didn't do this, then Ukraine wouldn't be a country.
And how's that?
Because they would have been overrun.
And so you're saying that this is a lesser of two evils argument. Am I understanding that right? It's either they get invaded
Well, I
or
think for the Ukrainians it
they
is,
become
yeah.
reliant on the so it's either they get invaded or they become fully and solely reliant on the United States and other
But
countries.
that's not true. Fully and solely reliant.
Yes, because that's
That's
what's going to
acting
happen.
like they have no industry at all in their own
They
country.
really don't.
What about all the grain that they're trying to export?
At this very moment, we are supplementing most of their industry because almost all of the industries have switched over to war manufacturing. We are supplementing their industry right now. So after the war, what's going to happen? Do you think the American companies that are currently supplementing the Ukrainian industry, do you think they're just going to pull out? Do you think they're going to look for other endeavors? No, the fact of the matter is,
Yeah,
no,
I think
the,
Ukraine has a promising future. Actually, I think that
the fact of the
they're
matter,
just going to rebuild themselves.
no,
They have a
no.
strong will and determination to do that. I think a lot of the bills that they've been passing.
The fact of the matter is, if I may, the fact of the matter is, after this war is over, if it ends favorably for Ukraine, Russian pullout or otherwise, in the event that this war goes good for Ukraine, after the war, Ukraine, it's very, very, very likely, and if it's very possible, if not likely, that the United States and its companies are going to be we will be switching from supplementing their industry to being their industry, fully controlling their industry. They will, after this war, it is very likely that that Ukraine will be they will be dependent on the United States. They will
Is
be.
that what happened to Britain?
Excuse me?
Is that what happened to Britain?
Is that what happened to Britain? Well,
Yeah.
considering the state of their military, yes, actually, that is what happened to Britain.
So Britain is fully relying on the U.S. France is fully relying on the U.S. South Korea is fully relying on the U.S. The Philippines is fully relying on the
South
U.S.
Korea,
Everywhere we've ever
South
been.
Korea, we built South Korea.
But
First
they're
of
not
all,
fully relying on us anymore.
not
They
anymore.
actually built themselves.
They branched off. No, we built them, and they branched off. That's a big difference. Okay. Considering
So
the state of the
so what did we do for their domestic policy?
considering the state of the British military and considering the state of the French economy, I think that the only country that has benefited from the United States involvement in World War II is Germany. That is the only country that I can find that comes to mind and that shows actual growth in the modern day from the
You don't
United
think
States
France benefited?
Benefited considering the current state of France right now? I do not believe so. No.
Really, one of the most powerful countries in the world, a nuclear powered country. They're not. No, you don't realize they're in the top 5 militaries around the world. They're a G7 country.
Yes, they are. They are in a good position. Yes, but are they well off currently?
Yeah, they are. Why do you think everybody in Africa is going on boats and trying to cross the Mediterranean? Yeah.
Well, I don't think France is very self-sufficient in its own energy because France only produces about 50% of its own energy.
Okay, but that doesn't mean they're satellite state or something. Every country is not independent on energy. China's not independent on
it's
energy.
looking to sink down. Yes, but I'm giving you an example of how they're not fully self-sufficient, and I like how
do they
McCarthy
get that
phrased
energy
that.
from the United States?
No, they don't.
You guys are kind of going off the beaten path with this. Just try and get to your point on how this is, with Ukraine. I don't think France's energy sector is really an example.
Okay, let's get back on track. The question is, does the United States involvement and funding of Europe as a whole, does that weaken European countries' positions and autonomy within Europe? If they are reliant on the United States, does that weaken their position in Europe?
No.
If the United States is bankrolling Ukraine or France or Norway or whoever, do you think that puts those countries in a worse position?
As opposed to what? What's the alternative?
Self-sufficiency. They're producing their own food, their own energy.
I know, but that's not the alternative here. The alternative is Russians coming across your border with the hundreds of thousands of men.
That is not the alternative. That is really not the alternative.
Really?
And if that is, that's the situation in Ukraine right now, and that's a European affair. Like I said, I'm under the firm opinion that Russia-Ukraine is a European affair. Yes, we can give humanitarian aid. Sure. Should the Red Cross be there? Yeah, absolutely. Whatever. This is a humanitarian issue for the United States. This is not an issue where we need to be sending men or munitions or weaponry. This is a strictly European affair.
NATO.
Yeah, and Ukraine isn't in NATO.
I know,
Okay?
but we need to defeat
Ukraine
the Russians
isn't
here
in NATO.
in
Why
Ukraine.
should we be sending NATO supplies to a country that isn't in NATO? And if we continue sending that NATO supplies, that's only going to make the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, because obviously at the current situation, Ukraine's not going to join NATO right now. But the efforts that we are taking, it sure looks like we're building the foundations of Ukraine in NATO. And that's only going to provoke Russia more and more into their advancement. That's all it's going to do. United States involvement, the United States pushing is only going to make the Russians push back harder at us. Okay? There's only going to be negatives to this. Sure, there's going to be a short-term economic boom because of our war industry, but no, there's really no upsides for the United States to be getting involved in a European affair.
This is not an NATO countries
this is not an issue
Russia
for NATO
and Ukraine.
This is an issue for the European Union. Okay, this is not an issue for NATO. This is not a NATO issue.
Ukraine's not in the European Union either.
It could very well become a NATO issue, but it's not at the current stand as it currently stands. It is not.
Do you think the Russians are likely to just be content with Ukraine?
Be content with Ukraine. Well, that is going to suppose, because we don't know nobody knows how this war is going to end or turn out. However, I think that if Russia does have their triumph over Ukraine, if they finally end this special military operation, as I call it, if Russia does triumph over Ukraine, I highly doubt that within the next 5 years they are gonna try something like this again, because they've seen the disastrous impact of this short-term thing. And that's the thing. We can scare them in the short term, but the long term, this is not a long-term game for the United States, because we can't keep this up.
Wouldn't you agree that it was a good thing that we supported them all this time?
We can't keep this up in the long term.
But you just admitted that the fact that they've lost so much material and men would mean that they wouldn't be likely to do it again in the future.
It's going to deter them from doing it again.
So does that mean it's a good thing that we did this?
It's going to, yes, partially it is a good thing. Two things can be true at once. Okay, it can be a bad.
Basically, you agree with the premise of the topic.
It can be a bad endeavor with marginally good results.
But I think that was the endeavor to begin with, was to make it a disaster for them, so they are humiliated, so their empire crumbles. So.
And why is that a good thing?
When countries are humiliated, they're not likely to do aggressive measures in the future. It would knock them off the radar for at least
we've already intimidated them. Why should we continue?
Well, it's not going to intimidate them if all they know is they just have to put on the show for a year and a half and then we'll leave.
Well, that's all we can really afford at the moment.
Why?
What do you mean, why? We cannot keep.
We have we make $4 trillion in the U.S. We've sent 150 billion of it to Ukraine so far.
And where else could that one? And where else could those billions go? Where else could they go? It's because it's so far fetched to think that could go to our own people instead of people we don't care about. Because that's the brass tacks of it. That's the brass tacks that you need to swallow. We don't care. Nobody cares about Ukraine. Ukraine is not a pressing fucking issue in the West.
It's not about Ukraine though. It's about Russia.
Pardon the language, but it's not a pressing issue.
I'm going to stop you right there. So I just want to add some clarification. So all military aid the U.S. sends is actually already in equipment. So whenever we say we send like 60 billion to Ukraine in aid for their military, most of that has already been spent and used. However, humanitarian and economic aid, that is in the form of actual
Yeah. And that's more
dollars.
so what I'm talking about, because I know we're not giving them, we're not like like just giving them stacks of cash. We're giving them equipment, but the thing I'm more so talking about is the economic and humanitarian aid. Now, humanitarian aid itself isn't that bad, but bankrolling their entire war economy that's not very good. It's not a very fruitful endeavor.
Where you make the argument, it feels like you were making the argument before that humanitarian aid would actually make them less like self-sufficient, and that's bad. Wouldn't
No, that's not
military
what
aid,
I
like
said.
fully
That's not what I
military
said.
aid, be good?
I specifically said, if you care to remember, I specifically said that humanitarian aid was a good thing. The Red Cross is a good thing. United States specific humanitarian aid, that's a good thing.
Yeah, I'd
However,
actually disagree. I think we should only
you
give
disagree
military
that
aid.
humanitarian aid, you'd favor military and economic aid, equipment aid, over humanitarian aid. That is,
Yeah, I think it
I'd
costs us
love
a
to
lot
hear
less.
that. I'd love to hear your position on that.
Well, the United States has lots of stockpiles of used equipment that we don't use. Some of it is almost at its expiration date that we were going to destroy. So it costs us way less to send this stuff over. And I think that's just our position in the world. I don't think it's our position to bankroll economies. I think the Ukrainian industry can do that. Like the Ukrainian businesses and people, like they know how to make a living. They're smart people, you know. But I think when we support them in a war effort, that would be our main job. That's basically most of the aid we've sent. Most of the humanitarian aid has been sent by the EU institutions.
Giving, yeah, and that's what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that we should scale up our humanitarian aid and scale down at least our equipment. Because sending old equipment, okay, that's fine because we're not paying anything. We're not paying to produce that. However, sending new equipment, because we've sent new equipment, and that's the thing. We're actively sending newer, more modern equipment there. So it's not just all old, outdated, rustic technology. It's there's a fair bit of newer technology that we're sending there. And it's not just us. It's not just the United States and its military that's sending it. There's companies like Lockheed that are sending planes, and they're sending them to, like, I'll give you an example. The Lockheed's building planes for Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, right now, and the Kingdom of Jordan is using those planes that we built them. They're sending them to Ukraine right now, because that's what's happening right now.
Yeah, all
So
the military equipment isn't made by the government. Every military
it's
equipment is made by
it's
a
not
contractor.
it's not like that. It's not like we are only sending them defunct equipment. We are sending them new equipment as well. So my opinion is that we should be scaling back the newer equipment, the equipment production of, and scaling up our humanitarian efforts, because that actually can sway over the American people. Because if you tell the American people that their tax dollars are going to be sent as military aid to another country who's at war with a country that we are not at war with, so it's really not our fight to fight, and that's not going to go over well.
Don't you think
However,
sending newer tech has had benefits to us?
has had benefits to us. I mean, sure, testing out our technology in Russia, yeah, it's like a Spanish Civil War thing. I mean,
You don't
yeah,
think
we
that's a
get to
benefit?
test out our new war technology, but why would we need that war technology? Because we're not going to war anytime soon.
Oh, you don't think we should prepare for war?
Prepare for war. I don't think
I don't think a major war is going to break out for the next 5 or 10 years.
Okay,
That's
well, I
highly,
don't think the Europeans thought that in 1913 either.
highly unlikely. Yeah, but that was a different time. That was a very different time because that was a spur of the that was a very spur of the moment thing. Yes, McCarthy. Of course. Okay. Okay, I'll start. For Ukraine, the opinion that I've seen for Ukrainian victory is the Russian retreat from Donetsk and Luhansk and the Russian retreat from current occupied Crimea. And for Russia, well, a Russian victory could look like many different things. Perhaps creating a rump state of Ukraine, such as Belarus, such as they did in Belarus, a very close rump state for Russia. I don't think simply annexing Ukraine as a whole is a viable option. So I think, in my opinion, that Russia would either take the Donbass or quote unquote liberate, as they like to call it, Donetsk and Luhansk, and keep Crimea. So either annex or air quotes liberate the Donbass region, leaving Ukraine, or what's left of it, like its mangled corpse, as a little rump state. I think that is the most viable solution, not solution, the most viable condition that Russia would follow. So yeah, those are my personal visions for what a Russian and Ukrainian victory.
So the question is what I think each side wants from the negotiations, or
What does a peace deal look like?
or what does a peace deal look like? Okay,
Yeah,
because
what are the win conditions?
as win conditions.
What's a reasonable demand for Ukraine?
Yeah, so I think there's only two acceptable outcomes for Ukraine. Either one would be the complete withdrawal of Russian troops from the territory of Ukraine, with the condition that Ukraine is always going to be neutral and stay out of the EU and NATO, or basically the reverse, is that you cede territory to the Russians and that Ukraine does join the EU and NATO as a security guarantee that they can never invade again. As for the Russians, I think that they would basically just be happy with a ceasefire, or like fully, obviously, ceding the territory.
And what territory?
I don't think they would really accept anything
How much do you
else.
think is what's the, if I may interject, what's the cutoff point of reasonable Russia, like reasonable amounts of territory Russia can annex or liberate into a rump state versus what's unreasonable? Where's that line for you? Where do you think that line
For me?
is? Because obviously Russia can't just annex Ukraine. So what do you think the line would be? Because I don't think the Russians would settle for a ceasefire. And I don't think that Russia could feasibly annex Ukraine and keep it all under control. So where do you think that line is? Where do you draw it?
Sorry, I had something to deal with it for a second. So the question is how much territory that I think is reasonable for them to cede?
Yes. How much do you think Russia, because like I said, Russia can't annex all of Ukraine. That's illogical. They know that. So how much do you think Russia can feasibly get or quote unquote liberate?
The only reason, like the only condition you should ever officially cede any territory to them would be if Ukraine is going to join NATO. That would be the whole purpose. I guess I would start with just the 2014 lines.
2014 lines. You think that Russia would just settle for a ceasefire? I don't believe so. Why do you think that?
Well, a ceasefire, Russia would like that, yeah.
I don't believe so. Because I don't believe they would put all of this effort in, all of this manpower, all of this force into an invasion just to settle for a ceasefire, because that would be worse than a loss.
No, it wouldn't, because you still get the territory. Russia doesn't care about a bilateral agreement. They'll be a unilateral agreement. Everybody there will be Russian citizens.
Think about how this is sold to the Russian people. This has been sold as a special military operation that was only supposed to last about 3 days. First of all, that's what the Russian people believed at the time. It's gone on for over a year. The Russian people, if Putin came home and said, well, we lost, well, that's going to be a bummer for them, but Russia's lost wars in the past. But if Putin came home and said, we have achieved a ceasefire, they beat us into submission so bad that we agreed to a ceasefire. We had to get bailed out. We had to sign a treaty saying that we would not attack them anymore. Do you understand how that would look to the Russian people who have been led to believe that they are taking part in a special?
Well, for one, I don't really care about what the Russian people think or what the Russian government, like how they control their society. That's up to them.
And how's that any different from people not caring about Ukraine? And I know that's calling back to an earlier argument.
Well, it's preferable for the Russian people to be upset and overthrow their government.
That's not. Why is that a good thing?
But I think your premise is wrong. If there was a ceasefire on the current line,
all due respect, you sound psychotic. Oh, the people need to overthrow their government. They need to be so unhappy. They need to be so miserable that they need to overthrow their government so their government looks a little bit more like mine. That's psychotic. Like, that's crazy.
Yeah, just to be clear, a ceasefire on the current lines would be like nobody would care about that. That would basically just mean Russia gets to keep the territory.
Yeah, but you're thinking about this from like a Western perspective. Think about the Russian people who have been led to believe that they are taking part.
Would be happy that the war gets to end. The Russian government would be happy that the war ends and that they can build up more forces for an invasion. They'd be happy that Ukraine's not going to join NATO because they didn't officially cede the territory. So that an ongoing war in the country.
If the United States went to war with China, right? And here's an example: if the United States went to war with China, and we said, well, we lost, right? We lost, so we had to give them Hawaii or something. We had to give them Guam or whatever.
That's not happening.
Yeah, but this is just an example. How would you feel? What do you think? Your opinion?
Okay, I wouldn't feel good about it, but this is really hypothetical.
Yes, this is purely hypothetical.
Because the Ukrainians aren't getting Belgrade. You're not giving Belgrade or the equivalent to the Ukrainians.
I'm not talking about the Ukrainians. I'm talking about the Russians, because this is not a Ukrainian thing. We're talking about Russia right now. If the Russians found out that they had agreed to a ceasefire, they agreed to a ceasefire. All of their young men died for nothing. Just to
they have more land that they have now than they had before.
No, they
have a land bridge to Crimea. They have the canal that goes to Crimea.
They've had that since they've had that since 2014. Okay, they've had that since 2014. That's almost a decade. They've had that. That's 9 years that they've owned Crimea. That's not going to boost their morale.
No, now they're going to own Kherson and Zaporizhia and the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk.
Oh, so you're saying a ceasefire on the current lines is going to be a good thing?
Isn't that what a ceasefire means?
A ceasefire on the... Okay, so you're saying... I was under the impression that you wanted a ceasefire and withdrawal. You thought...
Well, I would want the Russians to withdraw, yeah.
But we already know that the Ukrainians aren't going to agree to that. We already know that. They've said that.
A ceasefire?
So ceasefire on the current lines. They said that the Ukrainians.
I don't think they would ever accept an official secession of the territory. A ceasefire, after another year or something, and dwindling Western support, they obviously would.
Yeah, dwindling Western support, of course. But like right now, in a year, right? I doubt that their opinion's going to change very much, because the current Ukrainian opinion, the opinion of the people and the government, is that the only way that Ukraine will stop fighting Russia is that if Russia withdraws from Crimea, withdraws from the Donbass, like there is no feasible ceasefire on the current lines. That's just not possible. That's just not. That's illogical.
Well, Ukraine, like I said before, Ukraine needs to join NATO at the end of the war. If they have a security guarantee, then they'll stop fighting.
Okay, so you think that a guarantee that we would protect them is going to be enough for them?
I don't think the talk is really about the Ukrainians, though. I think the talk is about the ones who started the war, because the ones who started the war are the ones who have the decision to end the war, and that's the Russians.
Yeah, and I've already told you what the Russians want. The Russians would like a ceasefire on the current lines, maybe.
Well, yeah, the Russians just want any way out of it at this point and still saving face. That's what they want.
The Ukrainians know. The Ukrainians know that's just illogical, because they've already made it clear that that's not going to happen.
You don't think that's like a bargaining tool? Like put the
they've already
position on the
said
plate?
that. The government and the people have already made it very clear that they are not going to agree to a ceasefire on the current lines. That's just not going to happen.
If they join NATO after.
I doubt that.
And maybe not the current lines. I think maybe like putting a corridor to Crimea to the Donbass. Like maybe giving Berdyansk back to the Ukrainians, having a protected corridor on the highway.
Perhaps.
So I'll give you guys about 10 minutes to wrap it up. And then we're going to have
I don't have
a
any
section.
I don't really have anything left to say.
Okay, I mean, we can end it here if you want, but we'll have a section where people can ask questions if they like. Watchman, do you have anything else to add?
No. We can just go to the Q&A.
So,
let the people ask the questions.
Yeah, we can do this for 10 minutes or so. So who wants to ask a question? I know Sharp might be interested in that. You can either do it in text, or I can literally just bring you up to the stage and you can use your voice. Yeah, just do it in general chat. So everybody in the text, in the voice chat, you can ask the questions if you'd like.
Yeah. Is it in general chat, or is it on the debate stage chat?
General chat's better, but I don't care. They can use which one.
Makes sense.
Okay, so Sharp wants to ask a question. All right, go ahead.
Ask your question.
There you
go. Hello?
Hello?
You guys hear me?
Go ahead.
You guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, so I got a question for each of you. And just to be forward, I do have biases with this topic, so keep that in mind. But for the person who is arguing that the war in Ukraine is like the American involvement, the Western involvement in the war in Ukraine is a positive. Given that we are in the midst of it, and given that the Ukrainian government has an absolute position that the war cannot end until they liberate Crimea and the Donbass, how do you believe that the Western powers can carry this out? Is that a feasible goal? And if not, how do we actually end the war? Because if not, is the eternal conflict something that can be sustained? And then for the opponents of continued or prolonged Western involvement in Ukraine, given that the initial objectives of the Russians were the complete conquest of Ukraine, given that they already had de facto control of Crimea and the Donbass, is the fact that Western involvement has prevented that not a victory, and does that not then provide an argument for why the proponents of it are correct, that Western involvement saved Ukraine and therefore prevented Russia from acquiring the resource-rich land that they didn't already? So those are my two questions for each of you guys.
Yeah, I'll go first. So, for one, I didn't say that it's a positive thing in the war in Ukraine. Obviously, it's like a travesty that's going on. And like the West didn't start the war, but in terms of trying to take back their territory, was that the question? How do we help them take back it?
So my question for you was, given that Ukraine is holding an absolute position that the war cannot end until they reclaim all territory, and that is obviously a non-issue for Russia. Like that's not an acceptable solution for Russia. How do we end the war with those victory conditions? And if we can't, is it still a positive if we have to sustain it until Russia gives up?
So I think I alluded to some of this before, but the whole approach to the war, we should have like took a different approach to begin with, and I think we should have been more aggressive. Like when Kyiv was encircled by the Russians, we were basically debating on whether or not to send them javelins or not, and now we're debating to send them these F-16s, right? So we're by all these little debates of what should we do and what should we send them, we've been prolonging the war, and that's our fault. We should have just sort of funded them outright, and I'm sure they would have taken back way more territory. So that would have ended the war quicker. And also, like I said, selling oil and opening our exports to the Europeans, so they fund the Ukrainians more. That'll also help a lot to free territory. And if none of that works, which I think they would have had more territory than they have today if we did that. But if none of that works, then obviously try to negotiate harder with the Russians and the Ukrainians. By the two proposals I said before, you're either ceding territory and joining NATO or trying to get them to withdraw.
Okay. So now for the question you asked me. If I remember correctly, you asked me that if our involvement has gotten to this point where Russia cannot advance further, is that not a victory? As I said earlier in the debate, while yes, it is a temporary victory, two things can be true at once. Negative actions can have at least decently positive consequences. Yes, I suppose sending our equipment has resulted in a stalemate, which I don't believe is very good. I don't consider that a victory, but considering the fact that they cannot advance further, yes, I would consider that a victory, but I would not consider that a reason why we should continue sending our equipment, just because it has provided a temporary blockade of further Russian advancement. I don't believe that's a reason why we should continue sending them support, militarily at least. That's good. That's about it.
Yeah, that's my only question.
Well, it's been a nice debate, and I want to thank Watchman for talking to me. I want to thank McCarthy for hosting. I wish you all the best.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.